It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the small town of Maplewood, Ohio. The air carried the faint smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street, mixing with the crispness of autumn leaves scattered across sidewalks. People went about their day as usual, some shopping for groceries, others chatting over coffee at the local diner. Everything seemed normal, uneventful even, but sometimes the most ordinary moments can lead to extraordinary events. Chuck Norris walked into the grocery store, his tall frame and calm demeanor drawing only a few glances from shoppers. He wasn't the action hero everyone knew from movies or TV shows today. He was just an older man running errands like anyone else. His basket held a loaf of whole-grain bread, a carton of eggs, and a bag of apples. Nothing fancy, nothing out of the ordinary. Chuck had lived in Maplewood for years now, enjoying the simplicity of life away from the spotlight. As he approached the checkout line, he noticed Linda behind the counter. She was a young woman with mousy brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her name tag read Linda in simple block letters. She looked tired, her eyes darting nervously around the store as if she were waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Her hands shook slightly as she scanned items for customers ahead of him. No one else seemed to notice, but Chuck did. Years of training and experience had taught him to pick up on details others might miss. When it was finally his turn, Linda greeted him with a forced smile. "Hi there," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Chuck nodded politely and began placing his items on the conveyor belt. As she scanned each item, her movements became slower, more deliberate. It was almost as if she were trying to stall for time. Then, just as she handed him his receipt, Linda slipped a folded piece of paper into his hand. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against his palm. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Chuck saw fear, a deep, paralyzing fear etched into hers. She quickly looked away, pretending to organize receipts and adjust the cash register. "Thank you for shopping here," she murmured, her voice quivering slightly. Chuck didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tucked the note into his pocket without looking at it. He paid for his groceries, gave her a slight nod, and left the store. Outside, the cool breeze hit his face, but his mind was already racing. What had just happened? Who was this young woman, and why had she risked slipping him a note? Once he reached his car, Chuck sat down and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, he read the words scrawled inside. "Help me, they're watching." Below the message was an address written in hurried handwriting, somewhere on the outskirts of town. There was no signature, no explanation, just those 6 chilling words and a location that meant nothing to him. For a moment, Chuck stared at the note, his jaw tightening. He'd seen enough in his lifetime to know when trouble was brewing. This wasn't some prank or misunderstanding, it felt real, urgent. Yet he also knew better than to jump into action without thinking things through. Whoever they were, they clearly posed a threat to Linda. And if they were watching her, they might already be watching him too. Deciding to play it safe, Chuck drove home first. He unloaded his groceries, putting the bread in the pantry and the eggs in the fridge. Then he made himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note again. The address was unfamiliar, but it didn't take long for him to pull up a map on his phone. The location turned out to be an old industrial area, mostly abandoned warehouses and factories left behind when businesses moved elsewhere decades ago. Not exactly a place you'd expect to find someone in need of help. While sipping his coffee, Chuck thought about what to do next. He could ignore the note, chalk it up to paranoia or a misunderstanding. After all, he wasn't the same person. He used to be. Those days of covert missions and high-stakes battles were supposed to be over. Or he could investigate further, see where this trail led. Something told him ignoring it wasn't an option, not when someone's life might be at stake. By evening, Chuck had made up his mind. He grabbed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a jacket before heading back out. Driving toward the address, he kept an eye on his rearview mirror, checking for any signs of being followed. The roads grew quieter as he ventured farther from town, the glow of streetlights fading until only the headlights of his car illuminated the way. When he arrived, the scene was eerily still. The building was a run-down warehouse surrounded by tall chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. A rusty sign hung crookedly above the entrance reading Maplewood Manufacturing Co. in faded letters. Most of the windows were boarded up, but faint light seeped through cracks in the walls, suggesting someone, or something, was inside. Chuck parked a short distance away, hiding his car behind a cluster of trees. He approached, cautiously, keeping low and listening for any sounds. The hum of machinery reached his ears along with the occasional metallic clang echoing from within. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't abandoned. Peering through a gap in the fence, Chuck spotted movement near a side door. Someone lurked in the shadows, pacing back and forth. At first glance, the figure looked human, but there was something off about their posture, too stiff, too deliberate. Chuck squinted, trying to get a better look. That's when the person turned slightly, revealing a face he recognized instantly. It was Jake, a scruffy mechanic who owned the auto shop on Main Street. Everyone in town knew Jake as a friendly guy who always had a joke ready and grease stains on his hands. Seeing him here, though, was unexpected and unsettling. What was Jake doing in such a desolate place? "Jake?" Chuck called out softly, stepping closer. The mechanic froze, then spun around, his eyes wide with panic. For a second, Chuck thought Jake might bolt, but recognition dawned on his face and he let out a shaky breath. "Chuck, is that you?" Jake whispered, glancing over his shoulder, nervously. "You shouldn't be here." "I could say the same thing," Chuck replied evenly. "What's going on?" Jake hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. I got a note too. Same as you, I think. From Linda. She said, they've got her family. They're holding them hostage." The pieces started falling into place, but Chuck needed more answers. "Who are they?" he asked. Jake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't know their names, but—" He lowered his voice even further. "They're not human, Chuck. I swear. I've seen things. Things I can't explain." Chuck studied Jake's face, searching for any hint of dishonesty, but all he saw was genuine fear. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than either of them realized, and if Jake was telling the truth, then Linda wasn't the only one in danger. "All right," Chuck said after a pause. "Let's go inside. But stay close, and do exactly what I say." Jake nodded, gripping a wrench tightly in his hand. Together, they slipped through the fence and headed toward the warehouse, unaware of the challenges and revelations that awaited them inside. Chuck and Jake moved cautiously toward the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass and patches of dirt. The air smelled faintly of rust and oil, a reminder of the building's industrial past. Every sound, the creak of metal, the distant hum of machinery, felt louder than it should have, as if the night itself was holding its breath. As they reached the side door, Chuck signaled for Jake to stop. He pressed his ear against the cold steel, listening intently. Inside, he could hear faint voices speaking in low tones, though the words were unclear. Occasionally there was the clink of tools or the scrape of boots on concrete. Whoever or whatever was inside, they weren't alone. Chuck turned to Jake, his expression serious. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "If anything happens, you run. Got it?" Jake nodded nervously, clutching the wrench like a lifeline. "Got it." With that, Chuck pushed the door open just enough to slip through, Jake close behind him. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across the space. Rows of old machinery stood, silent and dusty, their surfaces covered in cobwebs. But toward the center of the room, things changed. Brighter lights illuminated a cluster of tables and equipment that looked far too modern for this crumbling building. Chuck scanned the area, taking note of every detail. There were 3 figures standing near the tables, dressed in dark suits that seemed out of place in such a rundown setting. Their movements were smooth but unnatural, almost mechanical. One of them held a clipboard, while another adjusted a device that emitted a soft, pulsating glow. The third figure stood slightly apart from the others, arms crossed, watching everything with an air of authority. In the middle of it all sat Linda, tied to a chair, Her head hung low, her hair falling forward to hide her face. Even from a distance, Chuck could see the tremble in her shoulders. She was alive, but barely holding on. Jake nudged Chuck gently, pointing to something off to the side. A stack of crates partially blocked their view, but Chuck could make out more people lying motionless on the floor. Some were wrapped in silver blankets, others connected to tubes and wires that snaked back to machines humming softly nearby. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just Linda. "We need to get her out," Jake whispered urgently. "And those people too." Chuck didn't answer right away. His sharp eyes caught something else, a shimmer in the air around the suited figures. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down his spine. These weren't ordinary humans. Jake had been right about that much. Before they could decide what to do next, one of the figures turned sharply, staring directly at them. "You can come out now," the figure said, its voice calm but carrying an edge of menace. "We know you're here." For a split second, Chuck considered retreating, finding another way in. But then he glanced at Linda again. If they left now, she'd be left at the mercy of these creatures. And based on what he'd seen so far, mercy wasn't something they possessed. Slowly, Chuck stepped into the light, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't armed. "Let her go," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "This isn't your fight." The figure regarded him coolly, tilting its head slightly as if studying an insect under a microscope. "On the contrary," it replied, its lips curling into a smirk that revealed rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "This is very much our fight. Your planet has resources we need and resistance is futile." Chuck's jaw tightened. He exchanged a quick glance with Jake, silently communicating a plan. Then without warning, he lunged forward, moving faster than anyone would expect from a man his age. His fist connected with the nearest figure's jaw, sending it stumbling backward. The impact echoed through the warehouse, followed by a startled gasp from Jake. Taking advantage of the chaos, Jake swung his wrench wildly at another figure, hitting it square in the chest. The blow didn't seem to hurt it much, but it did create enough distraction for Chuck to grab Linda's chair and drag her toward safety. "Are you okay?" Chuck asked as he untied her wrists. Linda blinked, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to involve you. I thought maybe you could help." "There'll be time for explanations later," Chuck said briskly. "Right now, we need to get out of here." But escape wouldn't be easy. The remaining figures regrouped quickly, surrounding them with unnatural speed. Their skin shimmered again, revealing faint scales beneath. Claws extended from their fingertips, glinting menacingly in the dim light. "You've made a grave mistake," the leader growled, stepping closer. "No one defies the veil." "The veil?" Jake muttered, his voice trembling. "What kind of name is that?" "They're not from around here," Chuck replied grimly, positioning himself between the creatures and the others. "Focus, Jake. We don't have much time." The veil attacked, moving with a fluidity that made them hard to predict. Chuck dodged one swipe, countering with a punch that connected solidly with its midsection. To his surprise, the creature staggered, letting out a guttural snarl. They might look alien, but they weren't invincible. Meanwhile, Jake struggled to fend off another veil, swinging his wrench desperately. "A little help here," he shouted, ducking as claws swiped dangerously close to his head. Chuck couldn't afford to focus on Jake for long. The leader of the group was circling him now, its glowing eyes locked onto his every move. "Impressive," it sneered. "For a primitive life form, you put up quite the fight. But it will not save you." Without warning, the creature lunged, aiming straight for Chuck's throat. Chuck sidestepped just in time, grabbing its arm and using its momentum to throw it into a nearby table. Equipment crashed to the floor, sparks flying as wires snapped loose. By now, Linda had recovered enough to crawl away from the fight, dragging herself toward the unconscious people on the ground. "Help me wake them up," she called to Jake, who was still struggling with the second veil. "I'm a little busy," Jake shot back, narrowly avoiding another strike. Frustrated, he slammed his wrench into the creature's knee, causing it to stumble. Seizing the opportunity, he kicked it hard in the stomach, sending it sprawling backward. Seeing their chance, Chuck grabbed a metal pipe lying nearby and swung it with precision, striking the leader across the side of its head. The blow stunned it momentarily, giving him enough time to shout, "Jake, get everyone out of here!" Jake hesitated, torn between helping Chuck and following orders. Finally, he nodded and rushed to assist Linda, shaking the unconscious individuals awake. One by one they stirred, confusion written across their faces. "What's going on?" A man groaned, rubbing his temples. "Where are we?" "No time to explain," Jake barked, pulling him to his feet. "Just follow me." While Jake led the group toward the exit, Chuck continued to hold off the veil. Despite his skill and determination, he was outnumbered. A claw grazed his shoulder, tearing through his jacket and drawing blood. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let the pain slow him down. The leader regained its footing, fury burning in its eyes. "Enough of this," it hissed, raising both hands. A strange energy began to build around it, crackling like static electricity. Chuck realized with growing alarm that this was no ordinary fight. It was about to escalate. Summoning every ounce of strength, Chuck charged forward, aiming for the source of the energy. If he could disrupt it, maybe he could buy enough time for everyone to escape. With a roar, he tackled the leader, driving it to the ground. The energy dissipated harmlessly into the air. "Go," Chuck yelled, rolling away just as the other two veil closed in. He knew he couldn't keep fighting forever, but he also knew his job wasn't done yet. Not until everyone else was safe. From the corner of his eye, he saw Jake ushering the last of the group out the door. Linda lingered briefly, looking back at Chuck with gratitude and fear in her eyes. "Thank you," she mouthed before disappearing into the night. Now alone, Chuck faced the veil once more. Blood trickled down his arm and exhaustion weighed heavily on his body. But his resolve remained unshaken. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. The leader rose to its feet, brushing off debris. "You've delayed the inevitable," it spat, "but you cannot win." "We'll see about that," Chuck replied, tightening his grip on the pipe. And with that, he prepared for the final round of the battle, knowing full well that the stakes had never been higher. The warehouse was a cacophony of noise, shouts, crashes, and the hum of alien machinery blending together in chaotic harmony. Chuck stood his ground, breathing heavily as he faced the veil leader. His shoulder throbbed where the creature's claw had grazed him, but adrenaline kept the pain at bay. He tightened his grip on the metal pipe, ready for whatever came next. "You're persistent," the leader growled, its voice dripping with disdain. "But persistence won't save you." Chuck didn't respond. He knew better than to waste breath on words when action mattered more. Instead, he watched closely, analyzing every movement the veil made. These creatures weren't just dangerous, they were smart. That meant he couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The leader lunged. Again, faster this time. Its claws slashed through the air, narrowly missing Chuck as he ducked and rolled to the side. The other two veil flanked him, cutting off any chance of escape. Chuck realized they were trying to wear him down, forcing him to expend energy while they conserved theirs. It was a classic strategy, one he'd seen countless times before. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to counter. As the leader pressed forward, Chuck spotted an opening. He feinted left, drawing the creature's attention, then spun around and swung the pipe with all his strength. The blow connected solidly with the veil's arm, snapping it back with a sickening crack. For a moment, the leader staggered, clutching its injured limb. Chuck seized the opportunity, driving the pipe into its chest and sending it stumbling backward. But victory was short-lived. The other two veil closed in, their movements synchronized like dancers in a deadly ballet. One swung at Chuck from behind while the other attacked from the front. He barely managed to block the simultaneous strikes, the force of the impacts vibrating up his arms. His muscles burned and sweat dripped down his face, but he refused to give up. Outside, Jake and the others had reached the safety of the woods. Linda led the way, her fear giving way to determination as she guided the group toward a nearby road. She glanced over her shoulder once, searching for any sign of Chuck. When she saw none, her heart sank, but she forced herself to keep moving. "We can't leave him," Linda said, her voice trembling. "He's still in there." Jake grabbed her arm gently, stopping her. "We don't have a choice," he replied, his tone firm but kind. "If we go back, we'll only get caught, or worse. Trust me, Chuck. Wouldn't want that." Linda hesitated, torn between loyalty and logic. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "Okay," she whispered. "But we need to find help. Someone who can fight these things." Jake agreed, though he wasn't sure where to start. They were miles from town, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. Still, they couldn't stay here. Not with the veil so close. Back inside the warehouse, Chuck fought on, his focus razor-sharp despite the odds stacked against him. The leader had recovered enough to rejoin the fray, its anger fueling its attacks. Every strike was brutal, every dodge a split-second decision. Chuck could feel his strength waning, his movements growing slower. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. Then, inspiration struck. Scanning the room, he spotted a control panel near the tables where the veil had been working earlier. Wires snaked out of it, connecting to various machines scattered throughout the space. If he could disable it, he might be able to disrupt their operation and buy himself a way out. With renewed purpose, Chuck launched himself toward the panel, dodging the veil's attacks as best he could. The leader roared in frustration, realizing what he was doing. It charged after him, claws extended, but Chuck sidestepped at the last second, using the creature's momentum against it. He slammed the pipe into its side, knocking it off balance long enough to reach the controls. His hands flew over the buttons and switches, pulling wires and smashing components. Sparks flew as circuits overloaded, and the hum of machinery faltered. Lights flickered overhead, plunging parts of the warehouse into shadow. The veil screeched in outrage, their forms shimmering faintly as if affected by the disruption. "What have you done?" the leader demanded, its voice tinged with panic for the first time. Chuck allowed himself a small smile. "Bought some time," he said simply. Then, seizing a fire extinguisher from the wall, he aimed it at the nearest machine and pulled the trigger. Foam sprayed across the equipment, shorting it out completely. The hum died altogether, leaving the warehouse eerily silent. The veil hissed in unison, their bodies glowing faintly as if struggling to adapt. Chuck didn't wait to see what happened next. Grabbing a piece of broken pipe, he hurled it at a stack of crates, causing them to topple and create a diversion. While the creatures were distracted, he sprinted toward the exit, his legs burning with effort. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a wave. He paused for a moment, catching his breath and scanning the area. There was no sign of Jake or the others, which meant they'd made it out safely. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Behind him, the warehouse groaned ominously, the structural damage from the fight taking its toll. Beams creaked, and walls began to buckle. Chuck didn't hesitate. He ran, putting as much distance between himself and the building as possible. Just as he reached the tree line, the warehouse collapsed in a deafening roar, sending plumes of dust and debris billowing into the sky. For a moment, Chuck stood frozen, watching the destruction. Then, with a weary sigh, he turned and headed into the woods. He needed to find the others and figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, Jake and the group had reached an old cabin tucked deep in the forest. It belonged to Karen, a retired schoolteacher known for her eccentric personality and love of conspiracy theories. She had always claimed aliens were real, though most people dismissed her as a harmless oddball. Tonight, however, her warnings seemed less far-fetched. When Jake knocked on the door, Karen answered almost immediately. Her sharp eyes widened in surprise as she took in the disheveled group standing on her porch. "What in heaven's name is going on?" she asked, ushered them inside without waiting for an answer. Once they were settled, Linda explained everything. The note, the warehouse, the veil. Karen listened intently, nodding occasionally as if piecing together a puzzle. When Linda finished, Karen leaned back in her chair, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "I knew it," she murmured. "I've been saying for years that something strange is happening in this town. Those disappearances, the strange lights in the sky, it all makes sense now." Jake frowned. "So what do we do? We can't exactly call the police about, aliens." Karen shook her head. "No, we can't. But I might know someone who can help. A friend of mine works at the university. He's into UFO research. Not the crazy stuff, mind you, but real science. If anyone can figure out what these things are, it's him." Linda looked skeptical. "And how do we even contact him? We don't have phones, and we can't risk going back to town." "That's where I come in," Karen replied with a sly smile. She disappeared into another room and returned moments later holding a dusty laptop. "This baby's got satellite internet. We can send an email and hope he checks it soon." While Karen typed up a message, Jake stepped outside to keep watch. He scanned the trees, half expecting the veil to appear at any moment. But the woods remained quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Back inside, Chuck finally caught up with the group. He entered the cabin quietly, his presence startling everyone except Karen, who seemed unfazed by his sudden appearance. "You look like you've been through hell," she remarked dryly, handing him a cup of coffee. Chuck accepted it gratefully, sinking into a chair. "Close enough," he muttered. After a brief explanation of what had happened at the warehouse, he turned to Linda. "Are you okay?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thanks to you." "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks." "Needed," Chuck replied. "Just tell me everything you know about these veil." Linda hesitated, glancing at the others. "They've been experimenting on people," she said softly. "Taking them, testing them, using them for something. My brother was one of them. I think they wanted to use me too, but I got away." Chuck's expression darkened. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," Karen interjected. "Longer than anyone realizes. People vanish and no one asks questions. It's like they're being erased." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew the stakes now. This wasn't just about survival. It was about exposing the truth and stopping the veil before they could do any more harm. Karen finished typing the email and hit send. "Now we wait," she said simply. "In the meantime, we prepare. Those things aren't going to stop coming." Chuck nodded, setting his empty cup aside. "Then let's get to work." And so, under the dim light of a single bulb, the unlikely team began planning their next move. They didn't have much, just scraps of information, makeshift weapons, and sheer determination. But sometimes that was enough, because when the world turns upside down, ordinary people become extraordinary. And Chuck Norris, for all his humility, was anything but ordinary. The cabin was quiet except for the soft hum of Karen's laptop and the occasional creak of the floorboards as people shifted in their seats. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the forest alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. Inside, however, tension filled the air like a storm about to break. Chuck leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face grim. He had cleaned the wound on his shoulder as best he could, but it still throbbed painfully. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, his mind raced with questions. Who were these Veil? What did they want? And most importantly, how could they be stopped? Karen sat at the table, her fingers poised over the keyboard. She glanced up occasionally, her sharp eyes darting between Chuck, Linda, Jake, and the others. "We need more than just theories," she said finally. "If we're going to fight them, we need to know their weaknesses." Linda nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. "They're not invincible," she whispered. "I saw them once. They got hurt when someone hit them with something metal, like iron or steel." Jake perked up at that. "So metal works? That's good to know. But what about those glowing machines? What do they do?" "They harvest energy," Linda replied, hesitantly. "From people. They take it from us and use it to power their ships or whatever they came here in." Chuck frowned. Ships? You mean they didn't just show up out of nowhere? No, Linda said, shaking her head. They have a base somewhere outside. Town, a big one. That warehouse was just a small part of it. Karen scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching against the paper. If we can find their main base, maybe we can shut them down for good. But we'll need help. And weapons. Weapons? Jake echoed nervously. You mean guns? Because I don't think any of us are qualified to handle those. Not necessarily, Chuck interjected. His voice was calm but firm. We don't need fancy gear. We need tools, anything strong enough to hurt them. Metal pipes, wrenches, even knives will work if we're smart about it. Karen nodded, in agreement. And I might have something else. She stood and disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a dusty wooden box. Opening it revealed an assortment of old gadgets and devices. Walkie-talkies, flashlights, even a pair of binoculars. These won't stop them, but they'll give us an edge. While Karen distributed the supplies, Chuck turned his attention to Linda. You said your brother was taken. Do you know where he is now? She hesitated, biting her lip. I think... So the Veil mentioned something about a facility near the reservoir. They said it's where they keep experiments. Experiments? Jake repeated, his voice rising slightly. What does that even mean? It means they're testing humans, Chuck said quietly, seeing how much energy they can drain before we break. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking, and everyone knew what was at stake now. This wasn't just about survival, it was about rescuing innocent people and stopping the Veil before they could do any more harm. Karen broke the silence first. All right, here's the plan. We split into 2 teams. One group goes to the reservoir to gather intel and try to free the captives. The other stays here to prepare reinforcements in case things go south. I'll lead the team heading to the reservoir, Chuck said immediately. Jake, you stay here with Karen and protect the group. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Chuck cut him off. You've done enough already. Besides, someone needs to make sure everyone stays safe. Reluctantly, Jake nodded. Fine, but promise me you'll come back in one piece. Chuck gave him a faint smile. I'll do my best. By dawn, the team heading to the reservoir was ready. Alongside Chuck were Linda, Emily, a tech-savvy college student who had tagged along after hearing about the situation, and 2 others from the group. Each carried makeshift weapons and basic supplies, including flashlights and walkie-talkies. The drive to the reservoir was tense. No one spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, the area looked deceptively peaceful. The water sparkled under the morning sun, and birds chirped in the trees lining the shore. But beneath the surface, something sinister lurked. This is it, Linda murmured, pointing to a cluster of rocks near the edge of the reservoir. There's a tunnel system underneath. That's where they're hiding. Chuck studied the terrain carefully. We'll approach from the west, stay low and stick together. If anything happens, fall back to the van. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they made their way toward the entrance. It was hidden behind a thick curtain of vines, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Chuck pushed the vines aside, revealing a narrow passageway leading downward. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of earth and decay. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. As they descended deeper, the sound of dripping water echoed around them, mingling with the faint hum of machinery growing louder with every step. Eventually, they reached a large chamber illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Rows of pods lined the walls, each containing a human figure suspended in green liquid. Some were unconscious, others struggling weakly against the restraints holding them in place. In the center of the room stood a massive machine pulsating, with energy, its core glowing brighter with every passing second. Linda gasped, tears streaming down her face. "My brother!" she cried, rushing toward one of the pods. Chuck grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Wait," he said firmly. "We need to disable the machine first. If we free them without shutting it down, they could get hurt." Emily stepped forward, examining the controls. "This looks complicated," she admitted, "but I think I can hack it." Do it, Chuck ordered. We'll cover you. As Emily worked, the others kept watch, scanning the room for any sign of the veil. So far it seemed deserted, but Chuck knew better than to let his guard down. These creatures were cunning, and they wouldn't leave their operation unguarded. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. Finally, Emily let out a triumphant whisper. Got it, the machine's powering down. The hum faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The pods began to drain, lowering the occupants gently to the ground. Linda ran to her brother's side, helping him sit up. He was pale and weak, but alive. We need to move fast, Chuck said urgently. Get everyone out of here. Just as they started ushering the freed captives toward the exit, a loud screech echoed through the chamber. The veil appeared, pouring in from multiple tunnels, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. Time to go, Chuck shouted, grabbing a metal pipe and stepping forward to block their path. The others followed suit, forming a defensive line. The veil attacked with ferocious speed, their claws flashing in the dim light. Chuck swung his pipe with precision, striking one creature squarely in the chest. It stumbled backward, giving him enough time to aim another blow at its head. Beside him, Linda fought fiercely, wielding a wrench with surprising skill. Emily stayed close to the captives, guiding them toward safety while keeping an eye out for danger. Keep moving, she urged, her voice steady despite the chaos. Jake and Karen monitored the situation from the van via walkie-talkie. How's it going? Jake asked anxiously. Not great, Chuck replied tersely. But we're holding our ground. Just be ready to drive as soon as we get there. Back in the chamber, the battle raged on. Chuck's movements grew slower, his strength waning with each passing moment. Blood trickled down his arm, soaking through the makeshift bandage. Still, he refused to give up. One of the veil lunged at him, its claws inches from his throat. At the last second, Chuck sidestepped, driving the pipe into its side with all his remaining strength. The creature collapsed, unmoving. We're almost clear, Emily called out, ushering the last of the captives toward the tunnel. Chuck took one final glance at the chamber, ensuring no one was left behind. Then, with a nod to the others, he turned and ran, following the group into the darkness. When they emerged into the daylight, the van was waiting, engine idling. Jake jumped out, helping load the exhausted survivors inside. Once everyone was safely aboard, Chuck climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut. Go, he barked. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, tires squealing as the van sped away from the reservoir. Behind them, the veil screeched in fury, but they didn't pursue. For now, the group was safe. As they drove back toward Karen's cabin, Chuck leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes briefly. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. The Veil weren't going to give up, not when they had so much invested in Earth. But neither was Chuck Norris. The van rattled along the uneven road, its engine groaning under the strain of carrying so many passengers. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but hopeful. The freed captives sat huddled together, their faces pale and weary, some clutching blankets Karen had thought to bring. Linda held her brother's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered reassurances to him. He was too weak to speak, but his faint smile told her he understood. Chuck sat in the passenger seat, his eyes closed, his breathing steady despite the chaos of the past hours. Blood still seeped from his shoulder wound, soaking through the makeshift bandage, but he ignored it. Pain was a distraction he couldn't afford right now. His mind was already racing ahead, planning their next move. They had struck a blow against the Veil, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Jake drove with grim determination, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every so often he glanced at Chuck, wanting to say something but holding back. Finally, he broke the silence. What do we do now? Chuck opened his eyes, turning to look at Jake. We regroup, he said simply. And then we hit them where it hurts. Karen, sitting in the back with the others, leaned forward. You mean their main base? That reservoir facility isn't their headquarters. It's just a piece of the puzzle. Exactly, Chuck replied. But it gave us clues. Those pods, the energy machine, they're part of a bigger operation. If we can find their main base, we can shut them down for good. Emily, who had been quietly tending to one of the injured captives, spoke up. I noticed something while I was hacking the machine. There were coordinates embedded in the system, encrypted but not impossible to crack. If we can decode them, they might lead us to their primary location. Karen nodded eagerly. That's where my friend comes in. He's got access to decryption software at the university. If we send him the data, he can help us figure it out. Good, Chuck said, but we need to act fast. The Veil won't stay quiet for long. They'll come after us. Back at Karen's cabin, the group worked tirelessly to prepare for the next phase of their plan. Emily set up Karen's laptop, transferring the data she had salvaged from the reservoir facility. Meanwhile, Karen tended to the wounded, cleaning cuts and applying fresh bandages. Linda stayed close to her brother, refusing to leave his side even when Karen suggested he rest in another room. Chuck, despite his injuries, took charge of organizing the team. He divided them into smaller groups, assigning tasks based on their skills. Jake and 2 others would patrol the perimeter, keeping watch for any signs of the Veil. Emily and Karen focused on decoding the coordinates, their fingers flying over keyboards as they pieced together fragments of information. The rest helped fortify the cabin, barricading windows and reinforcing doors. As night fell, the group gathered around the table for a quick meal of canned soup and stale bread. No one complained about the lack of variety. They were just grateful to have something warm in their stomachs. The mood was somber, but there was also a sense of unity, a shared purpose that bound them together. We've done well so far, Chuck said, breaking the silence. But this fight isn't over. Tomorrow we'll know more about where those coordinates lead. And then, we strike. What if they're expecting us? Jake asked, voicing the fear that lingered in everyone's minds. What if they're ready? They might be, Chuck admitted, but they don't know us. They don't know what we're capable of. We're not soldiers. We're ordinary people fighting for our lives. And sometimes, that makes all the difference. His words hung in the air, bolstering their resolve. For the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope. By morning, Emily and Karen had made progress. The encrypted coordinates revealed a location deep in the woods, miles away from any human settlement. It matched the description Linda had given earlier, a hidden facility protected by dense forest and natural barriers. This has to be it, Karen said, pointing to a map displayed on the laptop screen. Their main base. Chuck studied the map carefully, committing every detail to memory. We'll need to approach cautiously. If they see us coming, we'll lose the advantage. What's the plan? Jake asked. We split into 2 teams, Chuck explained. One will create a diversion, drawing their attention away from the base. The other will infiltrate and disable whatever systems are keeping them operational. Once that's done, we destroy the place. And how do we do that without getting ourselves killed? Jake pressed. We use what we've learned, Chuck replied. Metal disrupts them. Fire weakens them, and surprise is our greatest weapon. The group spent the rest of the day preparing. They gathered supplies, flashlights, tools, fuel for makeshift explosives, and rehearsed their roles until everyone knew exactly what to do. Chuck drilled them relentlessly, emphasizing stealth and precision. This isn't just about winning, he reminded them. It's about making sure no one else gets hurt. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the group assembled outside the cabin. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. Everyone carried weapons fashioned from whatever they could find. Pipes, knives, even sharpened sticks. Their faces were grim but determined. Remember, Chuck said, addressing the group one last time. Stick to the plan. Watch each other's backs, and above all, stay alive. With that, they set off into the woods, moving silently under the cover of darkness. The journey was long and grueling, the uneven terrain testing their endurance. But no one complained. They were driven by a single goal, to end the threat of the Veil once and for all. When they reached the edge of the Veil's base, they paused to observe. The facility was partially underground, its entrance concealed by thick foliage. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their glowing forms unmistakable even in the dim light. Chuck signaled for the diversion team to take position, while the infiltration team waited nearby. The diversion began with a loud explosion. A small device rigged with fuel and scrap metal detonated near the far side of the compound. The blast sent shockwaves through the area, startling the guards and drawing them toward the source. As chaos erupted, the infiltration team slipped past unnoticed, heading straight for the entrance. Inside, the facility was eerily similar to the reservoir chamber. Rows of pods, humming machines, and eerie green lights illuminating narrow corridors. Chuck led the way, his footsteps muffled by the soft padding of his shoes. Behind him, Linda and Emily followed closely, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They reached the central control room quickly, thanks to Emily's knowledge of alien technology. She worked swiftly, bypassing security measures and disabling key systems. "Got it," she whispered triumphantly as the hum of machinery faded. "Time to go," Chuck said, handing her a lit flare. "Light it when we're clear." They retraced their steps, moving faster now that alarms had begun blaring throughout the facility. The diversion team rejoined them outside, breathing heavily but unharmed. Together, they retreated to a safe distance before igniting the flares and tossing them into the compound. Flames erupted almost instantly, spreading rapidly through the underground tunnels. The veil screeched in fury, emerging from the burning structure in disarray. Chuck and his team watched from the shadows, ensuring none escaped into the forest. When the fire finally died down, leaving only charred ruins behind, the group stood in silence. The threat was gone, or at least neutralized for now. Exhaustion washed over them, but there was also relief. They had done the impossible. Linda turned to Chuck, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Chuck shook his head. "Don't thank me. This was all of us. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things." As dawn broke over the horizon, the group began the long walk back to the cabin. They were battered and bruised but alive. And though the world would never know what they had accomplished that night, they carried the knowledge with pride. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought in the shadows, and won by those who refuse to give up.